June 22, 1941. Dawn breaks along a frontier stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Adolf Hitler has ordered Operation Barbarossa into motion, convinced that the Soviet Union will collapse in weeks under the combined weight of tanks, aircraft, and rapid maneuver. The stakes could not be higher. If the gamble succeeds, Germany secures the resources to fight a global war indefinitely. If it fails, the Reich commits itself to a struggle of attrition it may not survive. At this moment, the world is about to witness what happens when armored warfare, air power, and grand strategy collide at full scale in World War II. The German invasion opens with an overwhelming display of coordination. Luftwaffe aircraft strike airfields, communications centers, and rail hubs before Soviet units can disperse. Entire formations of Red Air Force planes are destroyed on the ground in the opening hours. This air supremacy is not intended to win the war by itself, but to clear the sky so German armored columns can move without interference. Tanks, aircraft, and radio-linked command structures work together as a single system, compressing time and space in ways no army has previously managed. German panzer divisions surge forward behind rolling air attacks, bypassing strongpoints and leaving isolated Soviet units to be dealt with later by infantry. The emphasis is not on destroying every enemy force immediately, but on shattering the enemy's ability to think and react. Command posts are overrun, supply lines severed, and entire armies encircled before coherent resistance can be organized. In these first weeks, the integration of armor and air power appears decisive, confirming German confidence in a doctrine refined in Poland and France. Yet even in these early successes, cracks begin to form beneath the surface. The distances involved on the Eastern Front dwarf anything the Wehrmacht has previously faced. Roads deteriorate rapidly under the weight of heavy vehicles, fuel consumption exceeds optimistic projections, and maintenance schedules become impossible to maintain at the pace demanded by strategy. Air power can suppress enemy resistance, but it cannot rebuild bridges, repair engines, or shorten supply lines stretching hundreds of kilometers back to Germany. The Soviet response is chaotic but relentless. Initial losses are catastrophic, yet the Red Army does not collapse as Hitler expects. Factories are dismantled and moved east beyond the reach of German bombers. New formations are raised with alarming speed, often poorly trained but abundant in manpower. Soviet commanders begin to learn, through brutal experience, how to survive against combined arms assaults by trading space for time. As summer turns to autumn, the collision between strategy and reality becomes sharper. German armored units remain tactically superior, but they are increasingly worn down by constant movement and lack of rest. Luftwaffe support, once omnipresent, thins as aircraft are diverted to other fronts and maintenance backlogs grow. Tanks reach objectives ahead of infantry and artillery, leaving them exposed to counterattacks that air power can no longer always suppress. This pattern repeats across multiple theaters of the war. In North Africa, British and German forces test competing models of armored warfare under radically different logistical constraints. Desert terrain offers freedom of maneuver but punishes supply failures immediately. Here, air power becomes both a shield and a sword, protecting convoys while hunting enemy armor far behind the front. The balance between tanks and aircraft shifts constantly, dictated less by doctrine than by fuel availability, weather, and intelligence. American entry into the war adds a new dimension to this collision of forces. U.S. doctrine initially underestimates the tank versus tank duel, emphasizing infantry support and exploitation instead. Early encounters with German armor reveal the consequences of that assumption, forcing rapid adaptation. At the same time, American industrial capacity begins to reshape the strategic equation. Tanks and aircraft are no longer scarce resources to be preserved, but tools to be produced in overwhelming numbers and employed aggressively. Air power evolves alongside this industrial surge. Strategic bombing campaigns seek to cripple enemy production and transportation networks, directly influencing what happens on the battlefield. Tactical air forces become increasingly adept at working with ground units, responding to calls for support in near real time. Tanks no longer operate as independent instruments of decision, but as components within a broader system that includes aircraft, artillery, engineers, and logistics. By 1944, the collision of tanks, air power, and strategy reaches its most complex form in Western Europe. Allied landings in Normandy face a German defense built around armored counterattacks constrained by Allied control of the air. German tanks remain formidable, but moving them by day invites destruction from fighter bombers. Strategy forces them to concentrate armor for decisive blows, while air power punishes that very concentration relentlessly. The result is a battlefield defined by tension between potential and vulnerability. Tanks can still dominate local engagements, but only if shielded from air attack and supplied continuously. Air power can shape the battlefield, but only if ground forces exploit the openings it creates. Strategy attempts to orchestrate both, yet must constantly adjust to friction, weather, and human limits. Across every front, commanders learn that victory in World War II does not belong to tanks alone, nor to aircraft, nor to grand plans drafted far from the front. It emerges from the unstable interaction between these elements under pressure, where decisions made hours or minutes earlier ripple outward with irreversible consequences. The war becomes a test not just of weapons, but of systems that must function under uncertainty, exhaustion, and relentless enemy adaptation. As the conflict grinds on, the collision intensifies rather than resolves. Each side refines its methods, counters the other's strengths, and exposes new weaknesses. Tanks grow heavier, aircraft faster, strategies more ambitious, yet none achieve decisive dominance on their own. Instead, World War II reveals a harsher truth. Modern war is not won by a single arm, but by the ability to integrate force, information, and movement faster than the enemy can endure. And as the fighting continues across continents, the question that began on that June morning in 1941 remains unresolved on every battlefield. Can any army truly control the moment when tanks, air power, and strategy collide? Or does victory belong to the side that adapts fastest when control inevitably slips away? The uncertainty embedded in that question shaped every major decision taken after the war entered its final phase. By late 1944, no serious commander believed that any single breakthrough, weapon system, or doctrinal formula could end the conflict outright. Instead, success depended on sustaining pressure across multiple domains simultaneously, even as each domain imposed its own constraints. Tanks required fuel and maintenance, air power demanded secure bases and clear weather, and strategy had to reconcile political objectives with battlefield realities that changed by the hour. On the Eastern Front, this collision reached a level of intensity unmatched elsewhere. Soviet operational art matured into a sophisticated system that deliberately synchronized massed armor, artillery, and air power across enormous fronts. Rather than seeking deep penetrations with isolated spearheads, Soviet commanders emphasized sequential operations, each designed to unbalance German defenses further. Air power focused less on independent strategic bombing and more on isolating the battlefield, striking rail lines, bridges, and retreat routes ahead of advancing tank armies. Strategy here was cumulative, grinding down German capacity to respond rather than seeking a single decisive moment. German attempts to counter this evolution exposed the limits of late-war adaptation. New armored designs promised technical superiority, but they arrived too late and in insufficient numbers. Fuel shortages rendered even the most advanced tanks immobile. Luftwaffe units, once decisive, struggled to contest airspace against numerically and qualitatively superior opponents. Strategy became reactive, shaped less by choice than by necessity, as German forces attempted to plug gaps faster than the gaps could be closed. In Western Europe, Allied commanders faced a different but equally complex equation. After the breakout from Normandy, armored exploitation depended heavily on air power to keep German forces off balance. Yet rapid advances stretched supply lines to the breaking point, demonstrating that speed itself could become a vulnerability. Tanks outran fuel convoys, and airfields lagged behind advancing ground forces, reducing sortie rates just as opportunities expanded. Strategy oscillated between exploitation and consolidation, each phase carrying its own risks. Commanders learned that coordination was not a static achievement, but a continuous process. Radios, maps, and liaison officers became as important as guns and armor. Miscommunication could turn air support into friendly fire or leave armored units exposed at critical moments. Pressure magnified these errors, forcing leaders to decide whether to slow down to regain control or push forward and accept uncertainty as the price of momentum. The Pacific theater added yet another dimension to the collision. Here, terrain often restricted armored maneuver, elevating the role of air and naval power. Tanks were still valuable, but their impact depended heavily on air superiority and logistical dominance. Strategy emphasized island hopping, using air power to isolate enemy garrisons rather than destroy them outright. The interaction between tanks and aircraft was shaped by geography, reinforcing the lesson that doctrine could not be universal in a global war. Across all theaters, the human element remained decisive. Crews operating tanks under constant air threat experienced intense psychological strain. Pilots flying close support missions faced fire from ground defenses while attempting to distinguish friend from foe in rapidly shifting battles. Commanders bore responsibility for decisions that could not be reversed once set in motion. Pressure was not an abstract concept. It was lived daily by individuals whose choices determined whether systems functioned or failed. As World War II progressed, the collision between tanks, air power, and strategy produced fewer illusions and harsher clarity. No arm could dominate independently, and no plan survived contact without adaptation. Victory increasingly belonged to forces that could absorb shock, reorganize quickly, and maintain cohesion under relentless stress. The war did not reward perfection, but resilience. By the time the fighting approached its end, the shape of modern warfare had been irrevocably altered. Future armies would study these campaigns not for simple formulas, but for lessons in integration and adaptation. The collisions witnessed between steel, sky, and strategy revealed that power lay not in any single element, but in the ability to manage their interaction when certainty dissolved and consequences became unavoidable. That realization influenced how post-war planners would interpret the final months of combat, but for those still fighting, there was no luxury of reflection. In early 1945, the collision of tanks, air power, and strategy became even more compressed as operational timelines shortened. Objectives that once took months to plan were now conceived and executed in days. The margin for error narrowed, and the consequences of misjudgment grew sharper as exhausted armies pressed toward decisive political goals. In Europe, Allied advances forced constant reassessment of priorities. Should armored formations drive deep to seize river crossings and cities, or pause to allow airfields and supply depots to catch up? Air commanders argued that sustained pressure from the sky could paralyze retreating forces, but only if ground units secured bases from which aircraft could operate effectively. Strategy became a negotiation between competing imperatives, each valid yet incomplete on its own. The German response illustrated the limits of improvisation under extreme pressure. Desperate counterattacks relied on whatever armored units could be assembled, often without adequate air cover or fuel reserves. These efforts achieved occasional tactical surprise but failed to alter the strategic trajectory. Air power punished movement, and Allied armor exploited every opening, transforming temporary successes into costly dead ends. In the East, Soviet advances demonstrated how far integration had progressed. Tank armies moved in coordination with air units tasked specifically with suppressing German artillery and reserves ahead of the advance. Strategy emphasized depth and continuity, ensuring that breakthroughs were immediately reinforced rather than allowed to stall. The Red Army accepted losses at a scale that would have been politically untenable for other powers, converting numerical and industrial strength into sustained operational pressure. Yet even this system faced friction. Whether grounded aircraft, river-slowed tanks, and human endurance imposed limits that no doctrine could overcome. Commanders adapted by decentralizing authority, allowing subordinate leaders greater freedom to exploit opportunities or respond to setbacks. This flexibility, born of necessity, contrasted sharply with the rigid control that had characterized earlier phases of the war. In the Pacific, air power increasingly dominated strategic calculations. The destruction of Japanese naval and air strength allowed Allied forces to choose where and when to strike. Tanks supported these operations, but their role was shaped by terrain and supply considerations rather than grand armored maneuvers. Strategy here relied on denying the enemy the ability to contest the air and sea, illustrating yet another variation in how the elements of modern warfare interacted. Across all fronts, one pattern remained consistent. Pressure accelerated decision-making while reducing certainty. Commanders rarely possessed complete information, yet delay carried its own dangers. Choosing to act with imperfect knowledge became a defining characteristic of effective leadership. Those who waited for clarity often found that the situation had changed beyond recognition. As the war drew closer to its end, the collision between tanks, air power, and strategy produced outcomes that could no longer be neatly separated into tactical or strategic categories. A successful armored thrust could trigger political consequences by capturing symbolic cities. An air campaign might collapse an enemy's ability to resist not through destruction alone, but through exhaustion and despair. Strategy itself became inseparable from morale, logistics, and time. The experiences of World War II thus revealed a form of warfare in which control was always partial and temporary. Systems designed for coordination had to function in an environment defined by disruption. Victory emerged not from eliminating uncertainty, but from operating effectively within it, exploiting moments of imbalance before they closed. These lessons, forged under immense pressure and irreversible consequence, continued to echo even as the guns fell silent. The collision witnessed across continents did not end with the war's conclusion. It reshaped how future conflicts would be imagined, planned, and fought, leaving an enduring legacy of caution about any belief in simple answers to complex modern war. In the immediate aftermath of the fighting, the full implications of those collisions began to surface through captured documents, interrogations, and the testimonies of those who had survived. Analysts discovered that many late-war decisions on all sides had been driven less by confidence than by desperation. Strategy often became a tool for managing decline as much as for pursuing victory, with tanks and air power employed to delay the inevitable or shape the terms of surrender, rather than reverse the strategic balance. German records revealed how air power, once a pillar of early success, had become a constraint. Fuel shortages forced hard choices about which units could fly and which would remain grounded. Tanks were allocated to sectors not because they offered the best chance of success, but because losing them elsewhere would collapse morale. Strategy, stripped of freedom, narrowed to damage control, illustrating how even sophisticated systems fail when foundational resources disappear. Allied documents told a different story, but one still marked by uncertainty. Commanders debated how much risk to accept in pursuit of speed, aware that a miscalculation could prolong the war or increase casualties dramatically. Tanks and aircraft were abundant, yet their effective use depended on coordination that could never be taken for granted. Strategy required constant adjustment as political leaders pressed for rapid conclusions, while military realities resisted tidy endings. Interviews with frontline soldiers added another layer of understanding. Tank crews described the strain of operating in environments where air superiority did not guarantee safety, and where mechanical failure could be as deadly as enemy fire. Pilots recalled the difficulty of identifying targets amid fluid battles, knowing that a single mistake could have irreversible consequences. These accounts underscored that systems were ultimately operated by individuals, whose endurance and judgment were finite. As military theorists began to formalize lessons, a consensus emerged that World War II had marked a transition rather than a culmination. The integration of tanks, air power, and strategy represented a new baseline for warfare, not a final answer. Future conflicts would inherit these elements but face new variables, from technological change to political constraints that could reshape how collisions unfolded. The war's closing campaigns also highlighted the moral dimensions of strategic decision-making. Choices about where to deploy armor or direct airstrikes carried implications far beyond immediate military gain. Cities, infrastructure, and civilian populations were drawn into the collision, blurring distinctions between front lines and rear areas. Strategy had to account for these consequences, even when pressure and uncertainty made such considerations difficult. Looking back across the conflict, it became clear that the most successful forces were not those that achieved perfect coordination, but those that recovered fastest from disruption. When tanks stalled, air power compensated. When aircraft were grounded, ground forces adapted. Strategy served as a framework for this adaptation rather than a rigid script, allowing commanders to navigate chaos without being paralyzed by it. The legacy of World War II's Great Collision thus lay in its demonstration that modern war is an evolving system. Tanks, air power, and strategy are not static components to be optimized in isolation, but dynamic forces whose interaction generates outcomes no planner can fully predict. Understanding that interaction became the enduring challenge for those tasked with preparing for conflicts yet to come, where pressure, uncertainty, and consequence would once again converge. As those preparations took shape in the years immediately following the war, planners confronted a paradox revealed by the conflict itself. The more tightly integrated tanks, air power, and strategy became, the more fragile that integration proved under stress. Systems optimized for coordination were vulnerable to disruption at multiple points, whether through logistical breakdowns, weather, or human error. The challenge was not merely to refine doctrine, but to build redundancy and flexibility into forces expected to operate under constant pressure. Exercises and war games conducted in the late 1940s and early 1950s reflected this realization. Scenarios emphasized degraded communications, contested airspace, and rapid shifts in operational conditions. Tanks were no longer treated solely as breakthrough weapons, nor aircraft as independent instruments of decision. Instead, both were evaluated for how quickly they could adapt when assumptions failed. Strategy increasingly focused on resilience, accepting that uncertainty was not an anomaly, but a permanent feature of modern warfare. Veterans who transitioned into training and advisory roles carried these lessons forward. Their experiences cautioned against overconfidence in technology or doctrine. They emphasized the importance of initiative at lower levels, arguing that centralized control could not keep pace with the speed at which events unfolded once combat began. This emphasis echoed hard-earned lessons from World War II, where rigid adherence to plans had often proven fatal. At the same time, political considerations reshaped strategic thinking. The emergence of new alliances and the onset of geopolitical rivalry introduced constraints that wartime commanders had not faced in the same way. Decisions about deploying armor or air power now carried diplomatic implications, raising the stakes of miscalculation. Strategy had to balance military effectiveness with political risk, adding another layer of complexity to an already unstable equation. Technological development further complicated the legacy of the war. Advances in aircraft speed, weapon range, and communication promised greater control, yet also increased the pace at which situations could deteriorate. Tanks evolved to incorporate lessons about mobility and protection, but their effectiveness still depended on fuel, maintenance, and integration with other arms. The fundamental collision observed during World War II persisted, reshaped but not resolved. Historical analysis of the conflict increasingly highlighted moments where adaptation outweighed initial advantage. Campaigns once attributed solely to superior weapons were reinterpreted as victories of organizational learning and flexibility. Air power succeeded when it was responsive to ground needs. Tanks achieved breakthroughs when supported by logistics and intelligence. Strategy succeeded when it accepted uncertainty and acted decisively within it. These interpretations reinforced a central conclusion drawn from the war's experience. Control in modern conflict is always provisional. Gains achieved through coordination can be undone rapidly if pressure exposes hidden weaknesses. The capacity to recover, adjust, and reassert momentum becomes as important as the capacity to plan and execute. As scholars and soldiers continued to study World War II, the collision of tanks, air power, and strategy remained a focal point not because it offered clear answers, but because it illuminated enduring questions. How much risk should be accepted in pursuit of speed? When does concentration of force become vulnerability? How can leaders act decisively when information is incomplete and consequences irreversible? Those questions, forged in the crucible of a global war, did not fade with time. They persisted as reminders that the dynamics revealed between steel on the ground, power in the air, and decisions at the highest levels were not artifacts of a past era, but enduring features of warfare shaped by pressure, uncertainty, and the weight of consequence.